This video is part one in a series I'm putting together all about baseball stats. If you're new to the game or just want to understand more about the world of statistics in baseball, keep watching, and today I'll tell you all about pitching. Hey everybody, thank you for joining me in my channel Brutus on Baseball again. This video is the beginning of a three-part series all about the statistics that are used in baseball. Statistics have been used in baseball ever since the beginning of the game. In the 1850s, the box score was created by Henry Chadwick to keep track of stats during the game. And of course, stats were quickly used to determine who the best players in the game were, who was constantly hitting or pitching really well, and therefore deserved the best salary. I'm going to divide statistics up into three categories: pitching, batting, and defense. This video today is going to be all about pitching, because pitching is where it starts. Before you can play the game of baseball, somebody has to pitch the ball. Each of these statistical categories is further divided up into more traditional stats, counting stats, things that you can actually observe, and you can actually count them one by one. Whereas more recently developed statistics like advanced analytics or metrics really try to quantify the value a player gives to his team. These are harder to see sometimes, especially on the defensive side of the ball, or areas of the game that aren't historically as well appreciated as home runs and strikeouts, but still are really important to winning games for your team. Now, in this video, I'm not going to touch on the new advanced analytics or metrics. That's going to be for another video where I'll pick those apart and really dive into them deeper. Today I'm going to be teaching just about the traditional pitching stats, statistics that have been around for generations and are intrinsic to the history of the game of baseball. You see, over time, statistics became so integral to the game of baseball and really created a lot of the nostalgia that's around the traditional game. Records were set and broken over the years as players got better and stronger. But some of those old records have stood the test of time and still have not been broken, showing not only how difficult this game can be to play, but how good some of those older players were from generations ago compared to the peers of their time. So as I said, we're going to start with the first thing that happens in the game: pitching. Pitching statistics are traditionally based on two things: getting outs and preventing runs. Although there's an entire team of baseball players behind the pitcher, traditionally the pitcher has been the one that's been saddled with the most responsibility for winning the game for his team. The first basic stat that I'm going to run over really quickly is the pitch count. Pitch count isn't really tracked across multiple games or seasons, but it's kept track of in each game to determine how many pitches a pitcher has thrown, and ultimately how tired that pitcher might be. Historically, pitch counts were not tracked very well, but in more recent times, as pitchers wear down their arms from overuse, pitch counts became a lot more important to keep track of how much each pitcher is actually being used, and when they've been pitching too much. Historically, pitchers would pitch 120, 150, even more pitches per game. Back in the old days, 300 pitches per game was quite normal. But in today's game, you will rarely see a pitcher go over 120 pitches per game, and oftentimes not even over 100. The first pitching stat that's really tracked over multiple games and throughout the season, and therefore over years, is innings pitched. Innings pitched is pretty simple. A pitcher is credited for an inning pitched every time he gets 3 outs, because 3 outs make up 1 inning. If a pitcher doesn't pitch a full inning, let's say he comes and faces a few batters and only gets 1 out or 2 outs, he's not credited with a full inning pitched, but part of an inning pitched. This is expressed as a third of an inning after 1 out, or 2/3 of an inning after 2 outs. So if a starter in a game pitches a total of 6 innings, he gets 6 innings pitched. But if he throws 6 innings plus 2 outs in the 7th inning and doesn't get out of the 7th inning, he'll be credited with 6 2/3 innings pitched. The next stats that are kept track of are walks and strikeouts. Pitchers get credited with a walk every time that they pitch 4 balls to a batter without being able to get him out. On the other hand, if the pitcher can throw 3 strikes and get the batter out before walking that batter or giving up a hit, he's credited with a strikeout. Strikeouts are obviously desirable for a pitcher, whereas walks are not. Similar to walks is a hit by pitch. This is when the pitcher actually throws a pitch that hits the batter, and the batter is automatically awarded to first base. It's counted just like a walk, but it's kept track of separately. Now, the next counting stat kept track of for pitchers is hits allowed. This is every time a pitcher gives up a hit where the batter reaches base safely. So a hit allowed does not count if the batter hits the ball and is out at first base, or a fly ball that's hit in the outfield and is caught in the air. Wild pitches are also tracked as a statistic for pitchers. A wild pitch is when a pitcher throws the ball and it cannot be caught by the catcher, either because it's thrown into the dirt or well away from where the catcher is sitting. But the key here is a wild pitch is only counted when the runner is actually on base. If a pitcher throws a ball that cannot be caught by the catcher and no runners are on base, it's just counted as a ball. It's not a wild pitch. Important to note here real quick that if the pitcher throws a pitch and the catcher could have caught it, but he can't or he doesn't, it's actually not a wild pitch. It's an error on the catcher. And we'll talk more about that when we get into the video on defensive stats. Now, the first calculated stat that we're going to talk about for pitchers is WHIP. This stat is essentially used to determine how many base runners a pitcher allows for every inning pitched. The higher the WHIP, the worse the pitcher. The lower the WHIP, the better the pitcher. The equation for WHIP is walks plus hits divided by innings pitched. For example, if a pitcher gives up 8 hits and 3 walks over the course of a 9-inning game, then his WHIP for that game is 1.22. A WHIP under 1 is considered all-star level, and a WHIP of above 1.4 or so is considered to be pretty average, even below average. And obviously the majority of the pitchers in the league fit somewhere between 1 and 1.4. Most of the stats that we've talked about so far have to do with runners getting on base. This is the foundation of baseball, but the winning and losing of games has more to do with runners scoring, not just getting on base. So for this next section, we're going to talk more about the statistics that are kept for pitchers about being able to prevent runs from scoring. Now, the first stat is runs allowed. This is pretty obvious. A run allowed is counted against that pitcher whenever somebody from the other team scores a run while they've been pitching. But runs allowed are divided up into 2 categories: earned runs and unearned runs. The distinction between the two is, was the pitcher responsible for letting that run score, or was his team behind him responsible for it? An earned run means that pitcher was the one to earn the run. An unearned run means that his team was responsible for it. As you can imagine, an unearned run can happen from all sorts of circumstances, like a fly ball that's dropped in the outfield, or a ground ball that's bobbled in the infield, or maybe a throw that gets away from a player. Now, there are a lot of specific nuances to determine whether a run is either earned or unearned, but we're going to try to keep it really simple for this video and break it down into 2 categories. The first is that if a runner reaches base because of an error, either a defensive player drops the ball or throws the ball away, then that runner should not have been safe on first base. And if he later scores a run, it is unearned and doesn't count against that pitcher. And the second way that we're going to talk about, at least, that a run can be unearned is if a defensive player makes an error on what should have been the 3rd out of an inning, so the inning should have been over and the other team come to bat, but the inning keeps going because of that error. Any run scored after that error is considered unearned. In theory, that pitcher should have been out of the inning by that point, and so any run scored after that, even if he gives up home run after home run, doesn't count against him. And so the simple equation here is unearned runs plus earned runs equals total runs allowed. And the distinction is important because it measures how good of a pitcher actually performs versus how well his team behind him performs. Some pretty decent pitchers have had horrible seasons simply because the defense behind them is pretty awful. Now this leads us into our next stat, earned run average. The earned run average is another calculated stat that's essentially how many earned runs a pitcher would give up over the course of a typical game. It's calculated by the number of earned runs that a pitcher gives up, and then that number is multiplied by 9 to normalize it against a typical 9-inning game, divided by the number of innings that he pitched. So a couple examples here. If a pitcher threw a whole 9-inning game and only gave up 2 earned runs, then his ERA for that game would be 2. Pretty simple. But in our next example, let's say another pitcher gave up 3 earned runs over 7 innings pitched. Well, his ERA for that game would be 3.86. Much higher, right? It's because he gave up more runs over a shorter number of innings, and his ERA is almost 4 runs per game. Now, we can extrapolate that over an entire season. Let's say that same pitcher gave up a total of 53 runs over 171 innings pitched. His ERA for the whole season would be 53 runs multiplied by 9 divided by 171 innings pitched, which would be 2.79 runs per game over the course of the entire season. In today's game, an ERA under 3 is considered to be all-star level. Between 3 to 4 is a pretty good pitcher. 4 to 5 is around average, and above 5 is just not very good. The best pitchers in the game are the ones that have an ERA under 2 runs per game. A side note here, it's difficult to compare a stat like ERA for pitchers across eras, simply because some of the eras in the history of the game have been really high in offense, while others have been really strong in pitching. So a great example here is Pedro Martinez's ERA of 1.74 in the year 2000, right in the middle of the steroid era, is actually more impressive than Bob Gibson's 1.12 ERA in 1968, which happened at the time that pitching in the league was at its most dominant. Okay, enough math for now. Let's get back to basic counting stats and perhaps the most important stat, at least through the history of the game, for pitchers, and that's wins and losses. Now, wins and losses doesn't equate directly to teams' wins and losses. This is whether a pitcher is awarded with a win or a loss for that particular game. So in every game, there's one pitcher that gets the win, and there's one pitcher on the losing team that gets the loss. But who gets the win and who gets the loss is an important distinction. Now, pitchers are credited with a win for their game. For the starting pitcher, he must pitch a minimum of 5 innings and leave the game with his team in the lead, and his team does not relinquish the lead after he's left the game. If the starting pitcher leaves the game while his team is losing, or his team later gives up the lead after he's left the game, then he can no longer get the win even if his team does win. Then the win would be given to the most effective relief pitcher, usually applied to the last pitcher in the game where his team took the lead and kept it. Now, on the other hand, a pitcher is credited with a loss if he leaves the game with his team losing and his team does not later on in the game come back to tie or lead in that game. So this can be a starting pitcher that leaves the game with his team losing, or a relief pitcher that gives up runs to lose the game after the starting pitcher's already been removed. Now, pitchers have historically been evaluated based on their wins and losses. This has changed a little bit in recent years simply because we've come to realize that pitchers are not solely responsible for their team winning and losing. There's an entire team behind them, both on offense and on defense. Sometimes pitchers can pitch a gem of a game and lose 1-0. Does that mean that they had a bad day because they got the loss? We've come to realize that that's just not the case. A really great example of this is probably the most dominant pitcher in today's game, Jacob deGrom. He's won 2 Cy Young Awards, even though both years that he won those, he barely won more games than he lost, simply because the Mets team that he played for just wasn't that great. Historically, the best pitchers were ones that over the course of their career won 300 games or more, and that's slowly shifting to 200 wins, simply because pitchers these days just aren't pitching as often or as deep into as many games as they used to. 2 stats that I'll go over real quick that used to be really important to the game of baseball but just aren't as much anymore because of how we use pitchers these days is the complete game and the shutout. A complete game is when the pitcher throws the entire game. A complete game can result in a win or a loss, because a pitcher can throw a complete game but still give up 3 or 4 runs, while the other team gives up less. But a shutout is when a pitcher throws the entire game and does not give up any runs, obviously resulting in a win for that pitcher. Now, in the case of an extra inning game, a pitcher is actually not credited with a complete game or a shutout if they only pitch the first 9 innings and the game goes into extra innings. The only way for a pitcher to be credited with a complete game or a shutout is if the game ends with 9 innings only, or if the pitcher actually goes and pitches the entire game throughout the extra innings as well. Now, the reason that we're seeing fewer and fewer complete games and shutouts should be pretty obvious. With how much baseball players are making these days, it's a huge investment for teams to put their money into these pitchers. And so they've been monitoring pitch counts, which we discussed earlier, to make sure that no one pitcher is overworked too much and therefore has health issues with their arms. And in addition to that, a lot of these recent analytics have shown that the 3rd or 4th time a pitcher may have to go through the other team's lineup, he's just not as effective as he was the 1st or 2nd time through. So we're seeing a lot of teams that actually put their starting pitchers out there for fewer and fewer innings each game. Now, another stat that's still tracked and used a lot more often is the quality start. And a quality start is simply put as whether a pitcher threw a good game that day or a not so good one. A quality start is given if a starting pitcher throws a minimum of 6 innings in a game and gives up 3 or fewer runs. So boiled down, the quality start is all about the 2 things that the pitcher is most responsible for: getting outs and preventing runs. And if the pitcher was good at both of those things in that given day, and then the quality start is used to show that. The statistics that we've talked about so far can be applied to either starting pitchers or relief pitchers, but there is a class of stats that can only be applied to relief pitchers. These are stats like holds and saves and inherited runners. Now, a hold is given to a relief pitcher when he enters a close game and he's able to get at least an out and keep that game close. The definition of a close game is that his team has a lead of at least 3 runs or less, or the tying run is on base, at bat, or on deck. If any of those situations apply when a relief pitcher comes in, he could get a hold. Now, a save is pretty much the same thing. A relief pitcher comes into a close game and he's able to maintain the lead while getting outs. But in the case of a save, he's able to finish the game. So the hold stack is given in the middle of a game when a relief pitcher comes in. The save stat is given when a relief pitcher comes in to close and finalize the game. The flip side of a save is the blown save. And I think it's pretty obvious. A blown save is when a relief pitcher comes in to what's defined as a close game and he gives up the lead. He can't maintain it. Now, something that's interesting, a pitcher can actually come in and get a blown save for giving up the lead. But if his team then comes back in their half of the inning and wins the game, that pitcher can actually leave with a blown save and a win in the same game. An inherited runner for a relief pitcher is any runner that's on base already when that pitcher enters the game. Now, something that's interesting here is if those inherited runners score, who does that earned run count against? Well, since that runner was put on base by the previous pitcher, even if a relief pitcher allows that run to score, it's actually credited as an earned run against the previous pitcher. The relief pitcher can only get earned runs if batters that he faces reach base and then eventually score a run. All of these stats can be used in various ways, especially as ratios, to show who the best pitchers in the game are, to normalize the playing field between pitchers that are starting pitchers and maybe throw 7 innings per game, or relief pitchers that come in and just throw 1 inning. Who really has the best stuff? Sometimes relief pitchers are actually some of the best pitchers in the game, but they just don't start and throw multiple innings because they don't have the stamina or the variety of pitches to do so. These ratios include hits, walks, or strikeouts per 9 innings. So how many strikeouts does a pitcher get every 9 innings? Or how many walks or hits do they allow per 9 innings? And then there's the strikeout to walk ratio. This is how much control a pitcher has. How many batters does he strike out versus how many does he walk? And then, of course, win-loss percentage. How many wins does a pitcher get versus how many losses? And just before I wrap this video up, I'm going to talk just a little bit about advanced analytics and why they're important. Let's say you take one pitcher and you put him on a team that plays near sea level in a pretty big stadium, kind of like the Los Angeles Dodgers. He's probably going to have better pitching stats than if you were to put him in a smaller field or in the thin air of Denver where the Colorado Rockies play. In those situations, he might give up more hits and runs and home runs, even though he's the same exact pitcher. Well, advanced stats takes that into account. They're able to use advanced formulas to compare pitchers that play for different teams, and not only for different teams, different eras. Like I alluded to earlier, Pedro Martinez in 2000 had a really great season, one of the best of all time. So did Bob Gibson in 1968. But knowing that 2000 was the height of the steroid era when the most runs per game were being scored, and conversely in 1968, which was one of the lowest scoring eras in the history of the game. So how do you compare and how do you know whose season was actually better? Well, that's where advanced analytics comes in, to normalize these players based on the team that they play for, the location they play in, and the era in which they play. So I'm going to leave it at that, just to give a little taste of advanced stats, which I'll dive into later on another video. Thanks for joining again. As always, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, leave any comments or questions that you have down below, and I'll be sure to get back to you. And join me next time where I'm going to dive deeper into stats, starting with batting and then following up with defensive stats. Until then, have a great day, and as always, thank you for joining me in my channel.